The ambient temperature in my studio was 110 degrees, but the glass bead at the end of my blowpipe was cooling entirely too fast. It was subtle, only visible if you'd ruined enough glass to recognize the warning. The vivid, glowing orange of the molten silica was shifting into a dull, cherry red, a fraction of a second sooner than the thermal curve dictated. I kept the heavy steel pipe rolling across the metal arms of the bench, my eyes locked on the changing viscosity. The mixture was wrong. There was too much soda ash in the crucible, and not enough lime to stabilize the network. If I forced the compressed air from my lungs into the gather now, the internal tension would hold for a few hours, but it would inevitably shatter the moment it hit the cooling cycle in the annealing layer. I didn't try to force it. I never force bad glass. I lowered the pipe, tapped the steel shaft sharply with the back of a heavy pair of jacks, and let the hardening mass fracture. It dropped cleanly into the coal bucket with a sharp, resonant clatter. "The batch is off," I said quietly. I didn't raise my voice. The continuous, deafening roar of the glory hole, the secondary reheating furnace, filled the cavernous space. But I knew Truitt could hear me. My assistant was 50 feet away, sweeping the concrete floor near the loading bay. Truitt stopped sweeping and pulled off his protective earwear. "I'll recalibrate the flux ratio and dump the crucible for tomorrow. You need to pack your travel kit, Nathaniel. You have that emergency consultation at the spring flower garden in 20 minutes. I wiped my forehead with the canvas sleeve of my apron, feeling the grit of charcoal and sweat against my skin. I didn't want to leave the hot shop. The studio was a closed system. I understood the variables. Heat, gravity, centrifugal force, and breath. The outside world was unpredictable, heavily reliant on corporate politics, and largely inefficient. But the Preservation Guild had flagged this contract with a Priority 1 alert. The retainer associated with saving a historical artifact of this magnitude was enough to keep my furnaces running, and my staff paid for the next 8 months. I had too much pride in my craft to let a 19th century masterpiece be swept into a dumpster by a careless cleanup crew. I packed my heavy leather tool roll. I slotted in my precision calipers, a laser thermometer, a magnifying loupe, and a set of padded steel tweezers. I washed the soot from my hands, locked the studio bay, and drove across the city to the historic district. The Spring Flower Garden was a sprawling, Gilded Age estate dominated by a massive Victorian glasshouse. The air inside the main conservatory hit me the second I walked through the double doors. It was dense, heavy with the smell of damp earth, blooming jasmine, and the sharp, metallic tang of oxidized iron. I bypassed the front desk and walked straight toward the center of the grand rotunda. I found the source of the emergency immediately. A heavy, mechanized scaffolding rig had collapsed against the central iron pillar. Beneath it lay the shattered remains of the estate's focal point, a 12-foot, hand-blown botanical chandelier dating back to the 1880s. It was a masterpiece of intricate hollow-form green vines and ruby-red lilies, now reduced to a jagged mountain of colored shards scattered across the historic flagstone. Standing at the edge of the debris, her posture rigid, was Margaret Wright. I recognized her from the guild briefing file. 38, the current director of the estate, and the last operating member of the founding family line. She wore a tailored navy suit that looked entirely impractical for a humid greenhouse. She was rubbing her left temple in a tight, repetitive circle with 2 fingers. She was speaking to a man in a gray sport coat, her voice tight with heavily suppressed panic. "It was a failure with the third-party maintenance crew's hydraulic lift, Rhodes," Margaret said, keeping her chin raised. "The structural integrity of the conservatory itself is completely fine." Rhodes Thomas, the lead representative of the estate's board of directors, checked a heavy silver watch on his wrist. "It doesn't matter whose fault it was. Margaret, the terms of the historical deed restriction are absolute. The appraisal for the heritage grant is exactly 4 weeks away. Without that specific centerpiece, the structural grading falls below the state threshold. We lose the grant. I will have it restored before the committee arrives," Margaret stated flatly. "By who?" Rhodes countered, gesturing dismissively to the thousands of shattered pieces. "The original artisan has been dead for a century. The board has been warning you about the liabilities of this property for a year. It's over, Margaret. When we fail the appraisal, the board will override your directorship and force the sale of the south acreage to the commercial developers. Start looking at the severance terms." Rhodes turned and walked down the gravel path, his dress shoes crunching loudly in the quiet greenhouse. Margaret stood perfectly still for a long moment, Her knuckles stayed white on the clipboard even after Rhodes left, like letting go would make the whole place fall. She was fighting a losing war of attrition against a board that wanted to pave over her legacy, and she knew she was running out of ammunition. I stepped forward, the thick rubber soles of my boots making no sound on the damp stone. "You're losing your ambient humidity?" I said. Margaret spun around, startled. Her dark eyes locked onto me, defensive and sharp. "Who are you?" "Nathaniel Miller. The guild sent me." I didn't offer a handshake. I walked past her, my eyes scanning the high glass ceiling and the structural supports of the conservatory. The falling scaffolding tore through the automated ventilation membrane on the east wall. "If the humidity keeps dropping, your imported orchids in the adjacent wing will start stressing before morning." I set my tool roll on a cast iron bench. I pulled a roll of industrial thermal tape from the side pocket and walked directly to the damaged wall panel. Within 2 minutes, I had measured the tear, applied the tape to seal the membrane, and engaged the manual override on the hydrometer panel to compensate for the lost moisture. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards as the automated misting system kicked back on. I turned around. Margaret was watching me, the defensive set of her jaw slightly fractured by sheer confusion. "You're a glassblower," she said, her tone shifting into a more cautious, professional cadence. "Not a botanist." "Systems are systems," I replied, walking back to the pile of shattered art. "You fix the leak before you assess the damage. Otherwise, you lose the environment while you're staring at the problem." I knelt by the debris. I pulled my magnifying loupe and my precision calipers. I didn't touch the broken glass with my bare hands. The oils from human skin could degrade the exposed chemical layers. I used the padded steel tweezers to carefully lift a curved shard of what used to be a hollow green vine. I held it up, angling it so the natural sunlight from the glass roof hit the fracture line. "This is potassium lead glass," I murmured, observing the specific way the light refracted through the microstriations in the material. "The green color comes from a copper oxide mixture. The original maker didn't use modern optic molds. Every petal and leaf was hand-tooled on the punty iron." Margaret stepped closer, the hem of her suit brushing the damp stone. "Can it be fixed?" Rhodes wasn't lying. "The board is using this accident as leverage to dismantle the estate. I have 4 weeks before the grant appraisal locks." I set the shard down precisely where I had found it. I looked up at her. The clipboard in her hands trembled just slightly against the fabric of her skirt. "It can't be glued," I said, giving her the plain, mechanical truth without any dramatic cushioning. "The thermal expansion rates of modern commercial adhesives will cause the antique glass to crack further under the daily temperature fluctuations of this greenhouse. The sunlight will turn the resin yellow in 6 months." Margaret closed her eyes for a brief second. "So Rhodes is right. It's over." I didn't say that. I stood up, wiping the fine dust from my knees. "I can't glue it, but I can reverse engineer the chemical batch. I will melt down the unsalvageable shards to use as the base cullet, matching the exact chemical signature. Then, I will reblow the missing components and rebuild the iron armature." Her eyes snapped open. "In 4 weeks? If I sleep 4 hours a night?" "Yes. I need to oversee the process," she said immediately, her administrative control reflex activating. "I need daily progress reports. I need to approve every chemical mixture before it goes into the furnace. This is my family's legacy, Mr. Miller. I don't hand it over blindly." "No," I said quietly. Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" I pointed the heavy steel tweezers toward the floor, drawing an imaginary boundary between us. "My hot shop operates at 2,000 degrees. It is dangerous, it is loud, and it requires absolute, unbroken focus. There is a painted yellow safety line on the concrete floor of my studio. You will stay behind it. You will not dictate my chemical mixtures because you do not know how lime interacts with silica under heat. You will bring the salvaged pieces to my studio, and you will let me work." Friction sparked instantly in her expression. She was an executive used to compliance. "I am the client. I dictate the terms of the restoration. You are a director trying to save her estate from a hostile board," I corrected, keeping my voice entirely level and devoid of ego. "You are exhausted. Your focus belongs on the grant paperwork and managing Rhodes Thomas. If you try to micromanage my furnace, we both fail. I will restore your glass, but I do it my way." She stared at me, searching my face for arrogance. I offered none. I only offered a firm boundary built on professional competence. Slowly, the rigid line of her shoulders softened. She recognized that I wasn't fighting her for dominance. I was securing the parameters needed to win. Fine, Margaret said, her voice tight but compliant. But I bring the pieces to your studio personally. Every evening, I log them into the chain of custody. I work late, I warned her. So do I, she replied. The next evening, my studio was a cavern of heat and organized chaos. The main furnace roared with its continuous baseline of burning gas. Truett was turning a pipe in the reheating chamber to keep a core warm. At exactly 7 o'clock, the heavy steel door of the loading bay rolled open on its tracks. Margaret walked in. She was still wearing her suit from the office, carrying 2 heavy, foam-padded transport crates. The sudden blast of the 110-degree air hit her. She faltered for a second, her breath catching visibly, but she forced herself to keep walking until she reached the yellow safety line painted on the floor. I set my tools down on the marver and walked over to her. I reached out and took the heavy crates from her hands, bearing the weight effortlessly. You shouldn't carry these yourself, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the roar of the furnace. The structural integrity of the antique glass is compromised. A sudden drop will turn it into powder. I carried them carefully, she said, though she wiped a line of sweat from her collarbone. She looked around the soot-stained room. It's an inferno in here. It's controlled, I said. I set the crates on my steel inspection table, well behind the yellow line. Margaret pulled a thick binder from her leather briefcase. I need you to sign the chain of custody transfer. The board is auditing my every move. They want documented proof of where the assets are. I wiped my hands on my canvas apron and took the pen. She checked her watch twice in 30 seconds, her breathing shallow, the pen digging a deep groove into the paper as she pointed to the signature line. I have the first test batch in the crucible, I told her, handing the pen back. I'm pulling a gather now to test the coefficient of expansion. Margaret closed her binder. I'll wait and watch. It takes 20 minutes to gather and marver. I'll wait. She stood near the inspection table, refusing to sit on the metal stool I had placed there. I turned back to the furnace. I picked up a hollow steel blowpipe. Stepping up to the crucible door, I pressed the foot pedal. The insulated door slid open, and the blistering 100-degree heat washed over me. I dipped the pipe into the molten pool of clear glass, turning it steadily to gather a perfect, honey-like sphere of silica. I pulled it out and walked to the steel marver table. I began to roll the glowing mass, shaping the exterior against the cold metal. It required absolute precision. One uneven roll, and the glass would become off-center, ruining the optical clarity. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Margaret. She was watching my hands. She wasn't looking at the fire. She was watching the methodical, disciplined way I controlled the molten material. The tension in her jaw slowly began to ease as the rhythm of the work proved I knew exactly what I was doing. I blew a short, sharp breath into the pipe, capping the mouthpiece with my thumb. The trapped air expanded rapidly in the heat, pushing the solid mass of glass into a hollow bubble. I stepped over to the bench, sitting down and rolling the pipe along the rails, using the steel jacks to carve a neckline into the glowing orange sphere. 10 minutes later, I tapped the pipe. The glass fractured perfectly at the neckline, dropping into the annealing layer to slowly cool overnight. I closed the layer door and turned around. Margaret had finally sat down on the stool. Her eyes were heavy, her posture drooping slightly when she thought I wasn't looking. You make it look effortless, she said quietly. It's just repetition, I said. I walked over to the mini fridge in the corner, pulled out a cold bottle of water, and walked back to the yellow line. I didn't hand it to her directly. I pressed the cold plastic bottle lightly against the inside of her wrist. She gasped at the sudden temperature change, taking the bottle. You're overheating, I murmured, keeping a respectful distance. Your body isn't acclimated to this environment. She unscrewed the cap and drank. I have to draft the quarterly budget tonight when I get back to the estate. No, I said. She lowered the bottle, her defenses instantly rising again. I have a deadline, Nathaniel. When you're this exhausted, you miss numbers, I stated, reciting the practical reality of overwork. Rhodes lives for arithmetic mistakes. He will find the error, and he will use it against you at the next board meeting. Drink the water. Go home and sleep. Margaret gripped the bottle. She hated that the logic was sound. She hated being told to stop. If I stop, everything falls apart. If you break, everything falls apart, I corrected. I reached over, took the heavy binder from the table, and slotted it into her open briefcase. I snapped the brass latches shut. Go home, Margaret. The glass is secure. I will see you tomorrow. She looked at the closed briefcase, then at me. I wasn't issuing a command to control her. I was simply removing the option for her to harm her own case. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. Tomorrow, then, she whispered. For the next 2 weeks, 7 o'clock became a rigid anchor. She brought the glass, I signed the logs, and she sat behind the yellow line. I bought an electric kettle, leaving a ceramic mug of tea ready at exactly her preferred temperature, and angled the industrial floor fan to create a cool slipstream directly over her stool. On week 2, an email with Rhodes's name hit her phone and her tea stopped halfway to her mouth. Margaret stared at the illuminated screen, her jaw tightening. Rhodes, she said, her voice sharp. He just flagged the preservation budget for an emergency audit. He's demanding a line-by-line justification. He asked the board if I actually believe an independent contractor can reverse engineer a lost 19th century formula in a warehouse. What did you tell him? I asked, pulling a heavy gather of emerald green glass from the crucible. I told him I trusted you to deliver. The wooden block in my hand slipped a fraction of a millimeter. I corrected the torque so hard my knuckles went white, steam billowing up from the wet wood in a thick cloud that smelled of burnt cherry. She had trust issues that ran deep into her professional marrow, built by a lifetime of people undermining her. Giving me her trust publicly, staking her career on my forge against a hostile board, was a massive risk. I pulled the pipe from the bench and walked to the reheating chamber. I kept my eyes on the fire, ensuring my hands remained perfectly steady. I will ensure the board receives the physical proof they need, I said over the roar of the gas. I won't let you lose this. 2 days later, on Thursday morning, the timeline collapsed. I was at the estate conservatory, doing a dry fit of the newly blown green vines on the original iron armature. Margaret was standing beside me, holding the technical blueprints. We were working in sync, checking the load-bearing joints. The heavy glass doors of the conservatory opened. Rhodes Thomas walked in, flanked by 2 men in dark suits carrying hard plastic clipboards. Margaret's spine went rigid. Rhodes, the appraisal isn't until next week. There's been a schedule adjustment, Rhodes said, stopping in front of the scaffolding. He looked up at the half-finished armature, a thin, satisfied smile touching his lips. The Historical Grant Committee had a conflict in their itinerary. The appraisal is happening this Friday, tomorrow afternoon. Margaret's clipboard hit the stone floor with a sharp crack. You orchestrated this, she said, her voice vibrating with cold fury. You called the committee. You know the restoration takes 4 full weeks. I simply informed them that the estate was undergoing unexpected structural difficulties, Rhodes replied smoothly. They decided to expedite their visit to ensure the historical integrity wasn't compromised. It's out of my hands, Margaret. He looked at the scattered pieces of green glass on my work table. It seems you won't meet the deadline. The board will convene tomorrow evening to finalize the sale of the south acreage. Rhodes turned and walked out, his men following silently. The conservatory was dead quiet. Margaret stared at the closed doors. Her breathing was shallow and erratic. The careful control she had maintained for weeks was breaking. She looked at the massive, empty iron frame of the chandelier. The centerpiece, a massive, intricate, hollow-blown flower that required 3 distinct color overlays, wasn't even started yet. I failed, she whispered, the words sounding hollow. She stepped back, bumping heavily into the work table. Tomorrow. It's impossible. I lost my mother's estate. She covered her face with her hands, trembling visibly under the crushing weight of the failure. I set down my wrenches. I stepped toward her, stopping a foot away, keeping my hands entirely to myself. I tapped the edge of the steel work table. Twice a sharp, grounding sound. Margaret, I said, my voice low and steady. Breathe with me. Eyes here. She blinked, pulling her hands down, shifting her focus from the shattered glass to my face. At that thickness, the fastest safe cooling cycle is about a day, I stated calmly, breaking the crisis down into math and time. We have a little more than that. It is not impossible. It is simply a matter of thermal physics and endurance. Nathaniel, the color overlay alone. I will handle the overlay, I interrupted quietly, my tone absolute. You will handle the board. You will not let Rhodes see you panic. You will go to your office, you will prepare the grant documents, and you will leave the glass to me. I'm terrified, Nathaniel, she confessed. A raw, honest truth between us. I stayed right where I was, reinforcing the boundary, ensuring she knew she had the space to breathe and the agency to move. I know, I said, but you have a plan now. Go to your office. I need to calculate a new cooling curve. The next 24 hours were a grueling marathon of extreme heat and sleep deprivation. I didn't leave the studio. I didn't sleep. Truett handled the prep work and the smaller gathers. But the execution of the massive centerpiece was entirely on me. It was Thursday night, the eve of the appraisal. The studio was blistering. I was preparing for the final, most dangerous step of the process, the color flash. I had the massive core of the flower gathered on a heavy, solid steel punty. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. My shoulders burned with the physical exertion of keeping it turning on the rails. Margaret was there. She had refused to stay at the estate. She sat on the stool behind the yellow line, watching the digital pyrometer. I have to overlay the ruby red now, I called out, my voice hoarse from the dry air. The antique red requires gold chloride. It makes the glass incredibly stiff. If the core temperature drops below 1400 degrees during the overlay, the two layers of glass will reject each other and shatter from thermal shock. I didn't wait for her response. I stood up, lifting the 40-pound mass of glowing glass. I walked to the secondary color furnace. Truett had a smaller pipe ready, with a molten gather of the ruby glass. Now, I grunted, Truett dropped the red glass onto the edge of my clear core. I spun my heavy punty rapidly, wrapping the red glass around the exterior in a thin, even layer. The heat radiating off the 40 pounds of silica was scorching, singing the fine hairs on my forearms. It's cooling, Nathaniel, Truett warned, holding the laser thermometer. 1450. 1420. I needed to shape the petals before the glass locked up. I dropped the punty onto the bench rails. I grabbed a pair of large, heavy wooden paddles that had been soaking in a bucket of water. I pressed the wet wood against the blistering glass. A massive cloud of steam erupted, temporarily blinding me. I didn't need to see. I used the tactile feedback, the physical resistance of the glass pushing back against the wood, to feel the shape. I pulled, twisted, and flared the heavy edges, forming the delicate, sweeping petals of the 19th century design. 1400, Truett called out. It's locking up. I have it, I said through gritted teeth. I gave it one final, hard flare with the jacks. The shape held. The color flashed brilliantly under the intense heat. Layer door, I commanded. Truett pulled open the heavy insulated door of the annealing oven. I stood up, my muscles screaming in protest, and carried the massive piece to the oven. With one precise, sharp tap of a steel rod, the glass broke free from the punty and rested safely on the insulated floor of the lair. Truett slammed the door shut, locking the rapid temperature curve. I dropped the heavy punty pipe onto the concrete floor. It rang loudly in the quiet studio. I stepped back, leaning heavily against the brick wall, my chest heaving as I dragged oxygen back into my lungs. Margaret stood up. She crossed the yellow line. She walked past the bench, past the cooling tools, and stopped right in front of me. She looked at the closed door of the oven, then up at my face. Is it done? She asked, her voice hushed. It's in the annealing cycle, I said. If it doesn't crack by morning, it's done. She looked at my hands. They were trembling slightly from the sheer, sustained physical exertion. She reached out and gently placed her hands over mine. Her skin was cool, a grounding pressure against my calluses. It was a silent acknowledgement of the toll the work had taken. She didn't speak. She just held the grip steady, offering her presence as a counterweight to my exhaustion. I looked down at her. I recognized the profound shift in our dynamic. She was stepping into my space to offer support. I appreciated the gesture, but the risk of the glass cracking overnight remained. I slowly withdrew my hands from hers. You need to sleep, Margaret, I said, my voice steadying. Tomorrow is the appraisal. Go home and prepare. She nodded tightly, accepting the boundary. Thank you, Nathaniel. She left. I stayed awake all night, sitting in the dark, staring at the digital readout of the annealing lair, ensuring the temperature dropped exactly on schedule. Friday afternoon. The installation took 6 hours. The massive glass flower, a perfect, gleaming replica of the antique original, was bolted securely into the iron armature. The surrounding green vines and ruby lilies caught the afternoon sun, casting fractured colored light across the stone floor. I was standing near the back exit, zipping my tool roll closed. The metallic sound was sharp in the quiet greenhouse. My contract was complete. My job was done. At the center of the room, Margaret stood with the Historical Grant Committee. There were 3 of them, examining the structure with clipboards and cameras. Rhodes Thomas stood off to the side, his arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure. The lead appraiser, an older woman with sharp glasses, lowered her camera. She turned to Margaret. "The structural integrity of the centerpiece is flawless, Miss Wright," the appraiser announced, her voice echoing clearly in the large space. "And the preservation of the 19th century aesthetic is remarkable. It is a seamless restoration. The grant is officially approved." Margaret exhaled, a visible release of tension that seemed to lower her entire body by an inch. "Thank you." Rhodes stepped forward, his face flushed with poorly concealed anger. "This is highly irregular. A modern replacement does not hold the same historical value. The board must review this decision before the deed restriction is lifted." "The board," Margaret said, turning to face Rhodes. Her voice rang with a hard, unyielding authority. It was the voice of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for her position. "The board will review the signed grant approval at our meeting on Monday. A grant that secures the estate's finances for the next decade. The south acreage is no longer for sale. Rhodes. And if you attempt to circumvent my authority with the committee again, I will have the guild audit your private preservation expenditures." Rhodes stared at her. The power dynamics shifted violently, undeniably, right in front of the committee. He had no leverage left. He tightened his jaw, turned on his heel, and walked out of the conservatory without another word. The committee congratulated Margaret once more and departed. The room emptied, leaving only Margaret and me. I slung the heavy leather strap of my tool roll over my shoulder and turned to the door. "Nathanael." I stopped, my hand resting on the brass handle. "The contract is finalized," I said quietly, looking straight ahead. "I left the ongoing maintenance schedule and the chemical breakdown on your desk." "You're leaving," she stated. "My job here is done." I pushed open the door and walked out into the cool spring air. That night, my studio was dark. The main furnace was shut down for the weekend, leaving the cavernous room cold and silent. I sat at my desk in the corner, reviewing a pile of logistical paperwork. Truett was in the back office, running the final inventory numbers for the week. The quiet felt heavier than usual. I had secured her legacy, and in doing so, I had engineered my own exit from her daily routine. The heavy steel door of the loading bay rattled, then rolled open with a harsh mechanical screech. I stood up, my chair scraping against the concrete. Margaret walked in. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore a simple sweater and jeans. She carried a thick, leather-bound document folder. She walked past the yellow safety line, stopping at the steel inspection table. "It's quiet in here," she noted, looking around at the unlit furnaces. I stepped out from behind the desk. "The kilns are down for the weekend." "What are you doing here, Margaret?" "The estate is secure." "I know," she said. She opened the leather folder. "When I was dealing with Rhodes today, I realized something. I spent my entire life trying to prove to a board of men that I was worthy of holding this estate. I panicked. I let them dictate my timeline." She looked up at me, her dark eyes entirely clear, entirely certain. "You didn't just fix my glass, Nathaniel," she said. "You fixed my focus." She pushed a printed document across the steel table. The board approved a permanent position for a master conservator on the estate grounds. It includes a dedicated studio space in the North Annex and full autonomy over the restoration budget. I drafted the contract myself. I looked at the document. The terms were clear, practical, and permanent. It was a concrete, lawful integration of our lives. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy, antique brass key. The key to the North Annex. She set it on top of the contract. "You can say no," Margaret said, her voice steady, offering me absolute agency. "The position stands either way." Truett stepped out from the back office, a clipboard in his hand. He paused, seeing the official estate seal on the leather folder and the brass key resting on my inspection table. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. He tapped his pen against his clipboard, gave Margaret a respectful nod, and walked out the side door into the alley, leaving us the floor. The offer was witnessed. It was real. I looked at the key, then at the contract. The studio was cold for once, but the heavy brass key in my palm felt like heat. I recognized the reality of what she was offering, a place where my competence was valued, and a partnership built on mutual respect rather than crisis management. Then I sign, I said, my voice a low rumble in the quiet room. I picked up the pen and signed my name on the bottom line. And I'll show up every night we're open. Margaret smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression. She said, "Are you working late again?" I replied, "Just waiting for you." I learned that the right person doesn't add chaos. They bring water, hold the line, and show up again tomorrow. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.